Can you just like say your full title for the record?
Yeah, my name is Bastiaan Vanacker, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Communication at Loyola University, Chicago.
I've seen people argue that banning Trump from Twitter is taking away his freedom of speech. Where do you, let's just start there.
Okay, well, I think it's a great place to start because if you talk about freedom of speech in a constitutional sense as a legal right that we have, that is not at play here because Twitter is a private company. It can set its own guidelines. It can set its own terms of services. If tomorrow Twitter decided it no longer wants journalists on its network, it could kick off all journalists. It could kick off all college professors. So, in the narrow legal sense of the words, there is no infraction of his freedom of speech. Um, if Twitter were to be run by the government, it was a government's a public network, so to speak, there would be some constitutional issues, but that is not the case. So we can start there that in the legal sense, this is not an infraction of his freedom of speech.
Right. Well, and then, people say like, oh, well, yeah, they're a private company. They can do whatever they want. But, then you have people say like, oh, but they have too much power. And this isn't ethical. Like they shouldn't be able to like, and then you get this whole debate about censorship.
Mhm.
And it's so convoluted. It's so fascinating to me. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it is interesting because for a lot of people, critics of Trump's, this has come too late. They point out that Trump in the past, he has threatened nuclear war with Iran and North Korea. He has peddled falsehoods about the outcome of the election. He has singled out individuals who then were harassed by his followers. So some employees at Twitter, for example, who labeled his tweets. So he singled those out. So if you or I would have done that, maybe we would have been booted from Twitter. However, these social networks have, and defendably so, I think, have taken the stance that uh, elected officials should get more leeway. They're our representatives. They should have more leeway because the last thing they want to do is be seen as partisan, right? Twitter and Facebook are very afraid that they are perceived as taking a stance in ideological, political, cultural wars that we've seen going on right now in our country. So they're afraid of that. And I think for the longest time, they have given these elected officials in general and Donald Trump in particular a lot of leeway. And so some people on the left say, well, it's about time. Um, if you're a supporter of Donald Trump, or maybe just somebody who's not necessarily a supporter, but believes in the concept of freedom of speech and does not think that it's a good idea that somebody who gained 75 million votes in the last election represents what a lot of people are thinking in this country, like it or hate it, but that's the case. They don't like the idea that basically the leader of the free world is no longer given a platform on Twitter, while you know dictators in other countries still get to use Twitter. So those are, I think, are the two are the two sides of this argument. And I do see both sides. I do think that it's easy to criticize these networks for, oh, they're hypocritical. It's too late. They should have done it earlier. I think it is hard. I have given this exercise in my classes, for example, where I give students a number of posts and say, okay, design in terms of service, design a policy, and would you allow or would you not allow this post or this type of speech? And people are all over the place. There's no consensus. Everybody has a different view on this. It's very situation specific. So it is difficult. I don't envy them, and I think the approach they took of letting it go in a way was defendable. I think what changed in the last 7 days is, of course, that we've had an attack on the Capitol that by people who were inspired and motivated by the president's words at the rally, but also his rhetoric that's been going on for months on Twitter now about the election. While it was happening, the president did nothing to make it stop. He didn't use Twitter or social um, platforms to make it stop. He didn't do it, and that I think has changed. Because if you look at the reasons why Twitter gave for banning him, the two tweets they mentioned are pretty tame in comparison to some of the other tweets. They mentioned the fact that Trump said he's not going to attend the inauguration of Biden. Now, in isolation, that is not the most inflammatory tweet I've ever seen from Donald Trump. However, we have a different context now, right? We have a context where there are people at the ready to commit new acts of violence. And if Donald Trump were to tweet and give him the go ahead, chances are that we would have a sequel of what we saw last week. And I do think that ultimately Jack Dorsey does not want to have this on his conscience. And there's something we say in free speech, a famous saying that falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater is not protected speech. It's dangerous. And I think that's a little bit the situation we have here, where the nation right now is a bit of a powder keg, and one tweet of Donald Trump could be the match that lights the powder keg. And so I think it is very specific to this situation, to this set of circumstances. It is therefore, I find it somewhat surprising that the ban from Twitter is permanent for Donald Trump, if I'm not mistaken. From Facebook, it's indefinite, but Twitter said it's permanent, which means that if tempers will have cooled down, if Donald Trump is back a private citizen, albeit one with a lot of followers and somebody who will have the power to weigh on the policy of the Republican Party, somebody who will have the power to make or break political careers, to decide who gets elected or not. If he throws his support behind a candidate, that will still have a big impact. So I am somewhat uncomfortable with that voice no longer being heard on Twitter. I personally think that I would hope that it could be reinstated, because the alternative would be that he's going to get his message out, whether or not he's going to go to a different social network. Maybe he'll make his own, maybe he starts his own media company. No, but imagine then that we are already such a polarized country. Now imagine that on top of, we have different media, we have different cable outlets that we listen to, different radio stations that we listen to. We operate in different ideological networks. Now imagine if on top of that, we have a social network for the liberals and a social network for the Democrats. Or the
Well, some could argue we already have that with Parler, and
Mhm.
now with, Gab, and so some could argue that's already happening.
It is already happening, right? And but it would happen even more, because right now I've heard from the other day on the daily podcast of the New York Times, one reporter saying that actually it makes her job much harder. If she wanted to know what the alt-right was up to, she could go to Twitter and Facebook, and they were there, right? And now they kind of dispersed. They're on all kinds of different social networks. Sometimes it's encrypted. They might even go start using WhatsApp, in which case they will totally disappear. So for researchers, law enforcement, journalists, this segment of the American population, which we might consider dangerous, but at least they're out there, they can be seen, they can be studied, they might go underground. metaphorically speaking. Like, and that would, I don't know if that would be necessarily in the benefit of the country in the long term.
So just to kind of reiterate what you've said, you think that it is defensible that Trump was banned from um, these social media outlets. You know that it's legal. There's no infringement of his freedom of speech, of his First Amendment. But you do feel as though maybe down the road, he could, when he's, when Biden takes over, like he might be able to go back. So then that way, this doesn't escalate to
Yeah.
something more than it already has.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the that's something I would like to see, but there's a big if there, because once he's a private citizen, he would be bound to the terms of service like you and I are, and he would no longer have these exceptions that was kind of carved out for elected officials. I don't know if he'll be able to do that. So he might be able to come back, but he could be booted again. So
Do you know what those exceptions are for elected officials?
Well, for example, when he issued a threat against Iran and North Korea about, well, I forgot what the exact wording are, but paraphrasing, I was like, watch out, I have nuclear weapons too. I might just use them. Just kind of, people said that's a threat. That's a threat of violence. However, there's an exception, according to Twitter, if you are part of the military or a part of a government, then you can make these kinds of statements, right? And
I think the statement was something like, wasn't it the one where he's like, oh, I have a nuclear button on my
yeah,
desk and mine's
yeah,
bigger.
something to that effect. And with Facebook, for example, Mark Zuckerberg has said that, and kind of came back from that, but initially said false statements by politicians, we leave that alone. That's up to the marketplace to correct that. It's not up to us to say this is false. It's up to his or her opponents to point that out and let people figure it out. So in that sense, Trump has benefited from his elected official status to avoid being booted, and that might disappear.
Now, a lot of people think that or they know that he is dangerous on social media because he has been accused of, inciting
Mm-hmm.
the mob on January 6th. But I mean, is it dangerous for him to be banned when it comes to just censorship in general? Like, no, social media is not a news outlet. It's not journalism, it's social media, but it's where so many people get their information. So could it be dangerous to that marketplace of ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the argument that I can see, that it doesn't feel right somehow, right? That somebody is booted from a platform because of what he or she thinks. If people really think that this election has been stolen, intuitively in the United States, we feel a bit uncomfortable with having people removed from a platform for what they think. If people really think that, so I can see the discomfort with that. However, I think that I did question a little bit that Twitter really is that place where debate takes place. It's really this marketplace. I think Twitter has become more a forum to create a movement, to create enthusiasm, to rile up emotion. And this is why I think not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, Twitter has been used with great success by populists. If you look in European politics, it's the same. The parties that have benefited the most from social media are populist parties whose campaign ideas can easily be captured in a catchy slogan, right? Who who like to push the envelope a little bit, who do not have the sense of decorum that traditional politicians or traditional political parties have. So I think that is maybe part of the issue here, that if you are more well reasoned and you want to see things from both sides of the argument and you're open to a debate, that maybe Twitter is just not that. You're not going to find Twitter a very good medium. I think everybody has maybe had that experience
Yeah.
where you try to engage in a reasoned debate and you kind of like, well, I see it from that point of view, I see it from this point of view, and you kind of got slammed from the left and the right because you're trying to be reasonable, and that doesn't seem to be working on Twitter. So I see that argument, but I wonder if social media are really this public forum where there's a reasonable exchange of ideas, where we enter to with an open mindset, open to have our ideas challenged, open to an open debate. When I look at social media, I don't see that. I see a lot of shouting. I see people digging their heels in the sand. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I question a little bit that is the assumption behind that argument, even though in a way I do agree with it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's so like convoluted. Um and I guess, um the last, point I want to address is that I've heard people say like, oh, the media is being hypocritical celebrating Trump being banned. Um because, we should, as journalists, let anyone say what they need, and then we be the ones to report the facts, right? So people are saying like, oh, we're being so hypocritical for being so happy that he's banned. And first of all, that's an assumption that all journalists are happy about it. And second of all, I mean, I just I just wanted to lay that out there, see what your thoughts were.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's again, there's an assumption there about what journalists should be, and we do want, in a way, journalists be objective and detached and not be too involved and not take sides on an issue. I do think that's somewhat under pressure. We've seen that during the Black Lives Matter protests, where some journalists kind of broke that boundary a little bit, and I'm not saying it was good or bad, but you noticed it, that there was some kind of editorializing in the reporting. So I think we see more of that. I also think we kind of take that notion too far. If a journalist says about what happened in the Capitol last week, that is horrible. That's a disgrace. Would we, technically, though, that's not objective, but would anybody really object to a journalist taking a stance?
Right.
So as it comes to taking to looking at this with glee, I think journalists would have to be careful, because they still want, ultimately, even though right now Trump supporters do not like the media, right? They don't like journalists, and everybody, they're all liars. But ultimately,
Yeah.
in an ideal world, journalists would like to appeal to everyone, right? And journalists would like to be trusted also by Trump voters, also by Republicans. And I think, and if we want to move ahead as a country, I think if we get better, it would be great if we could agree again on the facts. Because right now we have a country that disagrees on the facts. We don't disagree on ideology, on opinion. We disagree on truth, on factual matters.
Mm.
And that is a problem. So, and I think that's ultimately the role of journalists, right, is lay out the facts. So I still believe in the role of objective journalism, and I know right now there's a lot of people who just by default will not believe anything that a journalist says, and I think that's very unfortunate. And I don't necessarily blame journalists for that, but I do think that journalists as a profession should try to overcome that, and should try however they can to bring these people back on board, maybe not ideologically, but so that we can agree on facts. Because if you cannot agree on facts, it's hard to have an effective democracy. If we cannot agree that the outcome of the election, which is objective, and it's an objective fact, right? Either Biden had the most votes in the electoral college, or Donald Trump did, and that should not be a matter of political opinion. Neither should the wearing of
Or a
masks.
matter of dispute, right?
Right, right. So it's a long-winded answer to maybe journalists should be a little bit careful with openly displaying glee and joy and relief that Trump is finally being booted off of Twitter.
Yeah, no, I think that you bring up a lot of awesome, awesome points. Is there anything else you want to add or say on the matter of free speech and the First Amendment and our president, before I wrap this up?
Um, no, I do have to say that I came here when I was at 23. I came from Europe, and here the United States has a much more radical interpretation of free speech. And at first, I thought it was way too far-reaching, and I thought it was too much freedom. I thought there was too much freedom for hate speech. I thought there was not enough respect for privacy on these issues. And taking some classes and thinking about it, and carving out my own career, I started to see that actually these ideals that we have of the marketplace of ideas, that we trust each other to come to an agreement, and that we're not afraid of people lying or having dangerous ideas, that we believe that as a democracy we can work this all out together. It's a wonderful notion. It kind of shows an American idealism and belief and trust in democracy and one another that right now is in jeopardy, and that I find sad beyond comprehension. So I really hope that we can move past this, because this is just a sad state of affairs.
Well, thank you so much for um, sharing all of that.